All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Minority Veterans of America's Public Policy and Veterans Panel. My name is Christine Reeves, and I am an honored member of the Board of Minority Veterans of America today. And with me, I have three amazing guests who are going to be joining us for this conversation. But to just get us started, I wanted to share a little bit more about what we're here to talk about today. So I'll start by saying, while we know that there is no all-encompassing correct definition of public policy, there's no doubt that public policy plays a big role and has a huge impact on the everyday lives of our community. Recognizing flaws in systemic discrimination within our current public policy is an important step to ensuring that every member of our community has equitable public policy. And so today in this panel, we're going to discuss the ever-changing role of public policy, particularly in the veterans landscape, but more specifically, how minority veterans have historically been left out of or not even considered in our public policies and the broader work being done to change that. So with us today, I'm going to start by introducing Tahina Montoya, who is joining us from, sorry, I'm scrolling here to find my, well, with us is Tahina Montoya. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical difficulty on my end. I apologize. Also with us is Peter Perkowski and Eduardo Vargas. There we go. Tahina is a first-generation Columbia American and a doctoral candidate at Georgetown University, where she's focusing on and pursuing a graduate certificate in women, peace, and security. Prior to her doctorate, Tahina served over 12 years in the United States Air Force as a multilingual international affairs strategist, working at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels within the US and internationally in Tanzania, Nicaragua, Qatar, Kyrgyzstan, Guatemala, Mexico, El Salvador, Colombia, and Panama. Tahina is currently a major in the United States Air Force Reserves, where she serves as the political and military analyst and is a woman in international security next generation symposium fellow. That is a mouthful, Tahina. And she also serves as the Women's Veterans Policy Fellow at the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. Let's welcome Tahina Montoya. As I said, also with us today is Peter Perkowski. He's a legal guru at Minority Veterans of America, where his work focuses on providing direct legal services to minority service members and veterans, as well as advocating before Congress and the Department of Veterans Affairs for systemic policy change on behalf of vulnerable veteran populations. Peter's also a clinical instructor at the Veterans Legal Clinic, one of 6 clinical offerings at the Legal Services Center at Harvard Law School, the school's oldest and largest clinical teaching facility. I'll let you dig in more on that, Peter, as we talk more about what happens at Harvard. But before joining the center, Peter served as the legal and policy director of OutServe SLDN, now known as the Modern Military Association of America. It's a nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to fighting inequality and injustice against military personnel and veterans based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status. Peter directly advised and assisted service members and veterans with legal needs pertaining to equal access, equal treatment, and equal services. He's also represented the organization in impact litigation and is amicus curiae, can you tell I'm not a lawyer, in high profile cases that would affect the lives of the LGBTQ plus military community. Peter holds a, morning, Peter. I just want to add that he holds a Juris Doctorate from George Washington University Law School. And so I'm telling you guys, we have some heavy hitters on our panel today. Last but not least is Eduardo Vargas. Good morning, Eduardo, and welcome. He's an active duty naval officer serving over 22 years at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels within the Department of Defense and interagencies. He's currently the naval attaché to the United States Embassy in Panama City, where he serves as the naval staff member for the Chief of Mission and Primary Naval Services Representative in country. He advises U.S. Foreign Service staff on naval matters, acts as a liaison officer for visiting U.S. naval forces and ships, and reports on political military developments. He's a member of the Naval Academy Minority Association and Association of Naval Services Officers, where he advocates for recruitment, retention, and promotion through career mentoring and outreach to develop future leaders who will assume the highest responsibilities of command, citizenship, and government. Again, friends, we have some heavy hitters on our panel today to talk about public policy and its impact on the minority veterans community. So thank you all so much for being here today. We're very excited to have you. And I'm just going to launch right in. But first, I want to highlight a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you joining us this morning, we do not have a chat box available to you, but what we do have available to you is a Q&A function. If anything strikes you this morning that our panelists are talking about, please do not hesitate to throw a question in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that, and we will try to pull some of your questions in when we get to that opportunity later in the panel. But we have some pre-designed questions this morning to get our panelists' juices going. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in and get started with that. So this morning, I'll just start by asking each of you, as you just heard, you all have very diverse backgrounds, particularly in the minority veteran public policy space. But I doubt that for any of you, that was kind of the career path that you started out on. So can you tell us kind of a bit more about your background, about you and how you began your work advocating on behalf of minority veterans specifically? And I'll start with Tahina.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's an honor to be here with both Peter and Eduardo. So how I began, I want to say, without really knowing it, I started as soon as I could when I commissioned and became a second lieutenant, only because I recognized how much my junior ROTC program helped me succeed. It was through them that I was able to get a scholarship to even afford to go to college. And I ended up getting an Air Force scholarship that led to the opportunity to commission. And so I did that, and I would always try to give back, which is what I try to do and kind of what's led me here today. So it started there. And I think it contributes to where this conversation hopefully will go, like the importance of being able to really reach out to youth. Let's not wait until they're older. Let's start when they're young so that they know that this space, the veteran space, the service space is available to them. But really how I came into this great opportunity to work with the House Committee of Veteran Affairs was kind of during my transition. I knew, first I need to say that transition seems like a very expedient term, and it's a very long process. And I found that out. I'm still in transition. And so it was through my work with the Department of the Air Force Barrier Analysis Working Groups, specifically the Women's Initiative Team and the Hispanic Empowerment and Advancement Team, both of which seek to identify barriers that service members face and change those barriers or knock down those barriers through policy change within the DoD. And it was through my work there that I saw a post for a fellowship opportunity with the House Committee of Veteran Affairs. And that's kind of how I'm here today. So it's very opportunistic, kind of by luck. And I feel very blessed and honored to be here. And I only hope I can do my part to make sure that this space becomes more diverse, equitable, and inclusive.
Awesome. Eduardo, you're joining us all the way from Panama City, I believe. So I would love to hear, since you kind of traveled the farthest with us today, would love to hear how you kind of got to where you are and how you got to join us today.
All right, thank you, Christine. So I enlisted in the United States Navy a long time ago, and I'm still in. And really, I've had quite a journey, go through the enlisted ranks, through the officer ranks. Like you stated earlier, right now I'm the naval attaché down here in Panama City. And I've become involved really in advocacy. So I'm really advocating for other minority service members. Really, I got into that. The more senior I got in the service, the more I looked around and realized that I really lucked out to make it this far in my career and where I am right now. And I want to pay that back and really give other service members and other folks, children, kids, who are looking or thinking about maybe careers in naval service or in the military, knowledge, education, and really help them achieve their goals.
Peter?
Thank you, and it's great to be here with all these other wonderful people. Sort of like the others, the way I arrived here was a combination of both opportunity and accident, and seeing gaps or holes that needed to be filled. Right, so I was invited to be on the board of what was then Service Members Legal Defense Network by a former law school colleague of mine who was on the board and was heading up their nominations committee. So I served on the board, and their mission was to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that had just happened. So everyone thought that the work was done, right? But here we are 10 years later, still doing the work for LGBTQ veterans and service members. And what happened is I saw an opportunity and a need. So I cycled off the board into the legal services department of the organization, and eventually just kept doing that. I think it was in 2013, I was still at a law firm and doing the work pro bono. In 2015, I went on staff as legal and policy director. At that time, it was OutServe SLDN, and did that work for 5 or 6 years. And now I'm doing it for MVA and for Harvard Legal Services. So my work is mainly with LGBTQ vets, but also other underserved veteran populations. And it is entirely about legal services for underserved and the most neediest veterans. So it was sort of an accident, and I'm glad I'm here because there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you for that. Well, I absolutely love that we have such a diverse panel in terms of experience and paths to this work, which brings me to the next question, which is, you know, it has been a year 18 months for all of us, but particularly as we've watched the pandemic kind of blow wide open the disparities in access to healthcare and access to opportunity. And the last year's brought a lot of changes, particularly in the policy landscape, and especially in relation to how minority veterans are viewed in that policy landscape. I'd love to just hear from each of you, what changes have you seen that have been the most promising, and what's been maybe more challenging as we watched this transition over the last year? And I'll start with Peter.
Most promising is the renewed focus on all veterans, right? It wasn't that long ago where the Veterans Administration or the Department of Veterans Affairs, I guess is the official title, was a dysfunctional organization and was not serving veterans well. So the renewed focus on that has only been good for all veterans. I do a lot of work for people who have what we call bad paper, other than honorable discharges or worse. In the past few years, even that has been improving. I'll give you a couple examples for MST, military sexual trauma. There's a renewed focus on that, a realization that a lot of veterans come out of service with military sexual trauma. And now the policy changes that most people who even if you have bad paper and you don't need service connection, you don't need a disability rating, and you can go to the VA and get help for MST. For LGBTQ vets, just 2 months ago, on the anniversary of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the VA announced policy clarifications that are supposed to be more lenient in the access of benefits and programs for people who exited the military because of those prior policies that policed sexual orientation and conduct. And right now they're undergoing a review of regulations that we call the regulatory bars for a character of discharge determination. There's a lot of gatekeeping at the VA, and hopefully those gates are going to be coming down. We're advocating hard for them to get rid of those.
Tahina or Eduardo, thoughts on that?
I'll second what Peter says, that there is, I wasn't aware of this until I was privileged enough to be able to be part of the House Committee of Veteran Affairs. And I do want to say that although I'm here in that capacity, what I'm going to say is more like a personal opinion, so it doesn't reflect the House Committee of Veteran Affairs or the Air Force Reserves. But I do agree that you don't recognize how much work is being done in that space until you're privileged enough to be in it and see it happen. So I do know that there's a lot of work being done to change policy, and it's very inspiring. Again, my personal opinion is I really do think we could all benefit, veterans, we could all benefit as a whole if we get DOD and VA to work together more. There's this big, huge gap, and the people that are falling through those gaps are veterans, and more specifically minority veterans, because it's hard enough to get access to the resources that are available. And there's so many great resources available, but having DoD and VA work together will help bridge that gap to make sure we're accessing more veterans, specifically those who are English as a second language or who feel that the resources aren't available to them, like women veterans and LGBTQ and religious minorities. So for me, it would be, there's a lot of work left to be done in making sure that the DoD and the VA work together to help what I hope we're trying to help, which is minority veterans.
Let me give a shout out to your committee, though. There are so many proposed legislation coming out of the members of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs that specifically target LGBTQ vets, women veterans, and veterans of color, specifically Black veterans. They ask us at Minority Veterans and to other advocacy organizations for our input on those bills. And it's so great to see that there's the focus of Congress people on fixing these problems. So way to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Eduardo, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I just want to add, from my perspective, one of the biggest changes I've seen in the last couple of years has been really a big push in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and seeing a difference in representation across the board, across the Department of Defense specifically. Individuals such as Secretary Austin, for me specifically, Secretary Del Toro, the Secretary of the Navy, and down here in my AOR area of responsibility for Southcom, the new Southcom combatant commander, General Richardson, who's the first female commander of Southcom. I see that, and I see big changes and really inspiring changes. It's very inspiring to see different individuals that look more like our country, more across the board, like the United States does. Over.
Well, that's amazing. And, I want to touch a little bit, Peter kind of brought in the MST conversation, and Tahina, you were talking a little bit about the work of the Committee on Women's Veterans. And I know that you just recently joined the staff on the HVAC committee, but with a particular focus on women veterans. And given the political landscape of 2021 and all of the changes in Congress and on Capitol Hill, can you share some of the work the committee's been doing, particularly around the Women's Veterans Task Force?
Yeah, so one of the things that I learned when I joined the House Committee of Veteran Affairs as a fellow is that there's 4 different subcommittees, and that each subcommittee is responsible for very specific portfolios. And I say that because I think it helps drive the initiatives of policy change, right? People are very, the portfolios that each cover are very specific to veteran needs. The subcommittees are economic opportunity, oversight and investigations, health, and then disability assistance and memorial affairs, or DAMA. And in my role as a fellow, my role is to kind of help out those subcommittees to address women veteran specific issues. So some of the ones that we've been focusing on, well, ones that have been at the forefront well before I got there, have been MST, mental health, homelessness, but ones that I've slowly have been kind of focusing more on is kind of what I mentioned earlier, the transition piece, which I do think, again, is forcing, again, lots of great resources available, but, and TAP is a great program. There is a need to continually improve TAP to make sure it's addressing the changing, ever-evolving needs of veterans, including minority veterans and everything that entails, and underserved veterans. And so just readdressing TAP, what are ways to improve it so that it's addressing the needs of the veterans before they transition. Also, accessibility for resources. So what are institutions doing to use IT and technology to access these veterans? We're talking rural veterans, LGBTQ veterans, women veterans, minority, ethnic and cultural minority veterans, Native American veterans. So how are these institutions using technology to reach these veterans, to make sure they're aware of their resources? And as I mentioned, MST is very, very big. Military sexual trauma, suicide prevention, are just some of the many, many topics that the committee at large focuses on. With my short time there, I've focused predominantly on TAPs, but I'm very excited and honored to be able to address more issues as long as the committee is willing to have me.
Well, we can say that they are lucky to have you and grateful. And you actually bring up an interesting point, and I think we've heard a little bit from Peter on just the challenges around what he referred to as bad paper or different discharges. And then you mentioned the transition assistance program. And so I would love to hear, Peter, actually from you, a great deal of your work's been focused on ensuring those folks with bad paper discharges are able to access their benefits and services through the VA. And Tahina may have a comment on this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that work that you're doing, Peter, has changed over the last few years and kind of what needs to happen from here to increase access for those folks, whether it be through the transition process or elsewhere for folks who have been given bad paper discharges.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't changed very much, except that it's it's growing, right? So I heard a stat recently, I think in an entire year, the VA used to get 3,000 character discharge determination applications in a year, right? So that's what, 10 a day? Last quarter or last month, they got 12,000, okay? So there are a lot more veterans out there who both have the need and are finally realizing, there is this process. We're going to see Rep. Underwood, or a video from her later. She introduced a bill called the Turnaways Act, I think it's called. And that's because one of the orgs I work for, Harvard, put out, along with some other entities like OutVets and Veterans Legal Clinic, Veterans Legal Services, I have to give credit where credit is due. We put out a report that said, when you arrive at the VA with an other than honorable, so many times you're just told to leave. And that's not how the law or the regulations work. You are entitled to determination about about your service record. So there's a lot more applications coming in. It's taking a lot more time. The only changes substantively is that the VA is actually looking at eliminating a lot of the barriers that are in the way of reaching eligibility for care and for benefits. And there are a lot of advocacy groups pushing. They're going through the rulemaking process, and we keep telling them, just eliminate these bars. Get rid of them. You don't need them. The statute itself has bars in it. You don't need your regulatory bars. Just let people have the benefits that they earn and that they need, right? So they're actually considering that, and we're very hopeful that in the next year or two, those will come down and it'll improve the process for everybody.
And just really quick, Peter, we have a question from Keith Williams. Can you just remind us all what is meant by a bad paper discharge?
Yeah, so everyone knows you have 5 possible characterization of service, right? Honorable, general, other than honorable, bad conduct, dishonorable. Anything that's other than an honorable or a general, the top 2, is what we call bad paper. A lot of them are other than honorable, and the number of other than honorables has been increasing over time, or the proportion since World War II. And the reason for that, we suspect, is that a lot of veterans are being placed in situations where they experienced trauma, and that trauma, a trauma of service, and that trauma is not treated, it's not recognized, it's PTS, a post-traumatic stress, and they act out on that trauma and they get into trouble. And then suddenly they're separated with a misconduct related discharge. That's bad paper. Misconduct, always bad. You walk into the VA with a DD 214 that says other than honorable, serious misconduct, and they're like, get out of here. But we are starting to recognize that the mental health condition was actually caused by service. It will be excused by the VA if a skilled, either a lawyer or an advocate, prepares this application that I've been referring to, character of discharge, and says the misconduct was the result of trauma. The person is, we have to use these words, insane, because it's in the statute, and therefore you should allow them service connection and give them benefits. But it's not easy, and that's why there's a whole system of advocates who have to do this.
Well, and it looks like there might be a few more questions in the chat that, Peter, if you'd be willing to hop over to the Q&A section, I think there's one more question specifically for you. But while you're doing that, want to kind of pivot here for a moment. We're talking a little bit about, how to support veterans after they've, as they transition out, as they're discharging. But, we've got Eduardo here who has been doing a lot of great work on how do we actually bring them in a better and more equitable way? How do we make sure that we recruit them and retain them with equity in mind? And so, Eduardo, I know that we mentioned earlier that you're part of the Naval Academy Minority Association and the Association of Naval Service Officers, where, you shared that you advocate for the recruitment, retention, and promotion of our veterans to be able to take on some of the highest command responsibilities in our armed services. Historically, though, service academies and the overall military have lacked diversity in officer roles, and racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual minorities are often overrepresented in enlisted roles. What type of policy and advocacy work needs to be done to ensure that more minorities have access to, I'm going to use the word historically marginalized, but what work needs to be done to ensure that more folks have the opportunity to serve in these officer roles and in the service academies moving forward?
Well, very loaded question. I guess I'll start off by saying that from my perspective, the most important tools just across the board and the most important work that can be done all centers on mentorship, outreach, and representation. And so just to talk about those a little bit and give you a little background and why I say those. When I got in 22 years ago, I didn't have anybody giving me guidance or explaining what I was going to be getting into. I literally went to a recruiter's office and signed papers without knowing what I was going to be getting into. And like I alluded to earlier, I have been extremely lucky. I've had very key people in my life, in my career, that thankfully guided me down the correct path and got me to where I am now. That's something that is not the norm. And it's something that from a mentorship and outreach perspective is what these organizations like the Naval Academy and Minority Association or the Association of Naval Services Officers are really focused on, providing those opportunities, providing that education. So outreach, and Tahina alluded to this earlier, outreach starts very early on. It needs to start, in all sorts of different communities and in different, via different avenues. So I work with an organization through ANSO called the Hispanics Inspiring Students, HISPA. What they do is they really look at grade school students, high school students, and they do outreach, really going out to underserviced communities, maybe communities with larger minority populations, and they just talk to kids about what opportunities there are out there. I didn't know anything about the Naval Academy when I enlisted. When I arrived at the Naval Academy, I had never even seen the campus. I did not know that it was located in Annapolis, Maryland, and I grew up in Falls Church, Virginia, literally an hour away from there. And it helped knowing, that there were other people like me that didn't know anything about that. But as I continued in my career and I learned that this was a problem, I really focused on trying to help people understand and learn about what the opportunities are out there. If people don't know about opportunities, then they may never, take them. So outreach in that sense, and then mentorship, right? So all of these different organizations focus on recruitment, but also retention. Retention is a big piece of the problem here, and there's many different policies that can maybe speak to and help with retention. I know that the DoD diversity studies on where retention can be helped, but it's still an issue. There's many minority or marginalized communities that do not stay in the military for multiple reasons. One of those, from my perspective, is that there's not enough representation still in the higher ranks. And that's why when I spoke earlier about some of the representation that we're seeing now in the form of the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, the different combatant commanders that are coming out, those are very, very important, because we need to see ourselves represented in higher levels of leadership. I don't know if that sort of answers your question there. To give you a little more background as far as what we're doing over at ANSO. So ANSO is really focused on all of the naval services, right? Which includes Merchant Marine as well as Coast Guard. And we focus very much on going out there, doing the outreach, and explaining what the processes are to be able to apply to and to the different service academies, and also work within the service academies and have either a naval or Army career, etc. Over.
Well, that's amazing, Eduardo. And it sounds like you are helping lead the charge to make sure that more folks particularly folks from historically marginalized communities, have the opportunity to serve their country in the formats in which we know them. So thank you for that work, and thank you for that answer and sharing more with us. I want to pivot a little bit, though, as we talk. I know we talked a little bit about historically marginalized communities, but I know that women in the military have also tended to be a historically marginalized community. And while they've definitely made more progress and more strides over the last several decades, we know that women veterans face deep disparities and are disproportionately impacted by challenges such as housing, food, employment stability. Tahina, I'm going to start with you, but I know, Peter, this may intersect well with the work that you're doing in the LGBTQ+ community. But what do you see as the greatest challenges facing women veterans? And I'm going to insert those who identify as women. And do you think that there's policy solutions that can impact these changes? Tahina, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I want to preface this with saying that all minority and underserved veterans, I feel that they face a lot of disparities. And I feel like that in itself could be a conversation that we could delve into for weeks. So as it relates to women veterans are the fastest growing population of veterans. And it's estimated that there's over 2 million women veterans currently alive in the United States, and that this is growing by 0.64%, I think, and it's expected to grow throughout 2045. So we are growing, and we are growing exponentially. I think one of the biggest disparities is because of how we have viewed veterans. Like, when you think veterans, typically what you think is male. A lot of the institutions that have been established to help veterans center and cater to specifically male needs, right? And so what happens and I think that's very important, I want to put that out there, but what happens is that you're not addressing minority and underrepresented needs, needs of the minority and underrepresented veterans, specifically in my case, women veterans. So to paint a picture as an example, if a woman veteran who most likely than not has children, has struggled, is transitioning and has issues finding employment and finds herself homeless, if you go to a homeless shelter, right now, the majority of homeless shelters are catered to male veterans. So think 1 floor, 10 rooms, 1 bathroom. If you are a woman veteran with children, first, convincing them that you are allowed in that space might be challenging because you have children, and sometimes they will take the woman veteran, but not the children. Women veteran will more than likely than not prefer to not be separated from their children, but then they also don't want to be in that space where they don't feel safe, right? Many women veterans are experiencing some form of trauma, whether it be PTSD or military sexual trauma related, and don't want to put themselves in an environment where they don't feel safe and that the children don't feel safe. So what's happening? They're couch surfing. They're bouncing from home to home, technically homeless, but couch surfing does not equate to homelessness, right? So this is a huge population that we don't even know how many of them are doing this, as an example. So what are some specific needs that are specific to women veterans? Think about healthcare services, right? A lot of organizations feel that if they're addressing veterans, they're addressing all veteran needs, right? I care to argue that you have to be you have to be very deliberate in targeting the needs of all veterans and everything that encompasses. And so for women veteran needs, you're talking about mammography services, right? That's certainly not something that you think about when you think about a male veteran. Birth control, daycare services in order to get mental health. Where are these women with children, if they're seeking help and they get an appointment, but they don't have someone to take care of their kids, they're probably not going to go to that appointment. So very addressing the needs of all of these minority groups, including women veterans, that target their group and what the challenges they're facing. However, I do want to caveat this, and we said this before Peter addressed it, is I am very inspired by the changes that are happening as it relates to the House Committee of Veteran Affairs. Congressman Takano and Congresswoman Brownlee, they're working so hard to really drive this change and push on all these policy changes. And so I think that's inspiring. I'm very honored to be part of the House Committee of Veteran Affairs during this time. And I really am excited to see this continue and this change continue to make sure that we're addressing all of the needs of all veterans, including women veterans.
That's amazing, Tahina. Thank you. Peter, Eduardo, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me just add a comment about LGBTQ vets, in particular, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming veterans. For that population, it really is a lot about cultural competency. First of all, a lot of LGBTQ vets don't even present to the VA because they are very distrustful at having been othered by the government and mistreated by the government. But when they do present, many of them don't feel welcome, right? We've had people turned away just because of sexual orientation, because individuals, not the organization, VA is actually very good in having policies to welcome this population, but individuals in VA, some of them are very bigoted. So there's issues with misgendering or misnaming trans veterans. There's a lot, there's actually what we call the donut hole of care for trans veterans. The VA will not currently cover transition-related surgery for gender confirming surgery. So they've started the process of eliminating that regulation, which is great. At least they announced it, but that process takes time. And there's also the issue with the doctors or providers don't actually understand care, because as Tahina said, they think straight cisgender, and when you have a person who's not straight or a person who's not cis in front of you, there's a different way that you need to approach medicine, and some of them just aren't good at it. And this varies across the country. I know there's 50 VA regional offices, and some of them are better at it, and some of them are not so good. So that's an issue that they need to address.
Eduardo, any inserts from you, my friend? Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going, but I want to make sure.
I think we have covered it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, Peter, I'll ask then, we've heard that you're doing a lot of work related to the LGBTQ and HIV plus military community and veterans community, and you've been doing that work for several years. And first, I think we mentioned earlier in your bio, we had talked about OutServe, SLDN, and modern military, and then through your work at the Harvard Law School and MBA, you've seen firsthand through this work that providing legal representation for discharge upgrades, you've seen the complexities and the intricacies of that process, as well as the impacts that bad paper have on the clients that you've worked with. What policies need to be enacted that would improve the discharge upgrade process? We talked a little bit about this, but I think it kind of hit off several questions in the Q&A. And so we'd just love to create a little bit more space for our conversation to add to that discussion about, what more do you think that we need to be doing? What impacts do we need to be mitigating to address that? And particularly, how do we best support if there's specific organizations? I think one of the questions in the chat was, what specific organizations can folks be reaching out to get the support that they need in that dialogue?
Yeah, I saw a lot of questions about who does this work, and Fortunately, there are a lot of organizations that do this work. There's veteran service organizations, the ones that you think about. Wounded Warriors Project was mentioned, Disabled American Veterans, Paralyzed Veterans of America, even the VHW and the American Legion can technically help. But there's also a network of legal, those are non-legal, there's a network of legal clinics at law school, like the one I work for. There are advocacy groups across the nation, advocacy groups in the sense that they provide legal services for people who don't have economic means to afford a lawyer. But these groups have legal services greater than just for veterans. They might have a little piece that helps veterans, and so there's a lot of groups that do this. Not just the VA work with the character discharge, but the discharge upgrade with the DoD side of the equation as well. What can help? Well, there's a couple things. The first is get rid of the regulatory bars. There's the advocacy organizations are working on that. There's also Congress. I mentioned a lot of legislation coming out of HVAC that is specifically addressing this problem. And advocacy groups like Minority Veterans, I'm putting on my MBA hat now, we are pushing that committee to address these issues more seriously, and not just the COD bad paper issue, but also these access issues for women, for veterans of color, and for trans people and LGBTQ people, to kind of right the wrongs of the past. Now, what can our listeners do? I mean, because that's a lot of work that requires, being part of a network of legal and advocacy, and many of us aren't. So what can you do? Well, sign up. I can't tell you how many times I get a request from a congressperson that says, I'm looking for a person in my district who has this experience, X, whatever X might be. And we're constantly scrambling. Well, do we know anybody, or can we put out a request or a call? Or so the more people that we know, the bigger our network, the more likely we are to find the person that congressperson wants to talk to and hear from, because it's the voices that make a difference. I was recently on a call as part of my work here at MVA with a senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, and we were trying to convince her to support the Equality Act. We got 4 veterans into that call, and it was amazing when senators hear directly from their constituents whose lived experience addresses the question. So what can you do? Sign up, be present, raise your hand when needed, and hopefully, we can start moving mountains.
That's amazing. And Tahina and I were just chatting. We were listening to you intently, Peter, but Tahina brought up a good point about, it's even beyond the discharge, it's about how we're helping support veterans as they age through this whole process, right? We connect a lot of veterans when they're in their, their teens and their 20s, even maybe as late as their 30s, but then, as they continue to access these benefits post their discharge and they age in the system. And so Tahina, I don't know if you wanted to add to that conversation about the work that the committee is doing to make sure that we're continuing to serve veterans, from career to beyond. Would love to hear more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful conversation because Eduardo's bringing in the piece of how to recruit and improve retention within the service. And Peter and I are talking about addressing issues as they transition. And specifically in the committee, we obviously address veterans issues. And I did want to mention that that's the whole gamut of issues, not only when they're transitioning, but when they're newly transitioned, to make sure that they're on their feet. And as I mentioned in the chat, the House Committee of Veteran Affairs also recognizes that there's veterans that are aging. Like, you're a veteran and you're a veteran for life, right? So there's not a stop block where we no longer care for veterans. And we also recognize that those needs are ever evolving, just like they're ever evolving when you're first transitioned. And so we are doing research to identify specific needs, in my case, to women veterans as they age, and how we can best address that in order to make sure that veterans not only get access to the resources they need when they first transition, but that they retain the access to all these resources as they age, because it's something that they, as I always say, quite literally fought for. And so it's something that they deserve.
Thanks for that, Tahina, and a really good reminder that when you sign up to serve our country, you earn the title of veteran for life, and those services and those benefits come with it. So thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time together, and I have one last question for you all before we get an exclusive sneak peek video from Congresswoman Underwood. But this last one's a little harsh in the sense that a lot of what we've been talking about today is about how to address historic and systemic issues that have negatively impacted historically marginalized, underrepresented communities. And I think often when we talk about this work, we talk about how we want to make sure that we're getting, an equitable process, an equitable benefit for folks. But we know, quite frankly, that a lot of these systems have been built over the last 200 to 400 years with exclusion and oppression in mind. And so my last question for you today is really around the fact that we know that historically marginalized, underrepresented minority veterans broadly have been impacted by systemic discrimination, and that they face disparate outcomes as a result of a system that at its best isn't designed for them, and at its worst was designed exclusively to oppress them or to exclude them. To undo this harm, it's going to require policy solutions tailored to create not just equal, but equitable and just outcomes for all. What do you see as the most urgent policy priority or priorities relating to minority, historically marginalized and underrepresented communities? Because each of you has such a different expertise that you're bringing to this conversation. Would just love to hear your thoughts on that. And what do we need to be doing to move this agenda forward?
I'll jump in, and I'm going to pivot because I've been talking a lot about fixing things, historical harms and what we need to do to undo injustice. And I'm going to both point my finger at and praise and appreciate Eduardo, because one of the biggest things we need to do is to fix the military itself and do things to make it stop harming service members, right? Because the reason that we're here dealing with marginalized veterans is because they come out of service harmed by the system themselves. So I love that Eduardo is, and the military is focusing on diversity, inclusion, and equity, because the more it does that, the fewer veterans come out with problems that need to be fixed. Yes, always there's going to be wounded veterans who have both invisible and visible wounds, right? And those can be dealt with, but the problem with our communities, women, veterans of color, LGBTQ, non-religious veterans, is that the policies of the past are the things that harm those veterans, right? So thank you, Eduardo, and let's all support the DoD in these efforts.
Thank you, Peter. Coming from you, though, those are very big words. I very much appreciate that. And it's a very difficult problem set, and there's no easy answer how to address, the current culture and how things are right now. But I'm going to piggyback on something that Peter said earlier about, get involved. And I think that really speaks to what I was talking about earlier as far as outreach and mentorship. I think that the most important thing we can all do is get involved in whatever programs it is, whether it's something like ANSO or the Naval Academy Minority Association, or whether it's working with MVA or working with all the different organizations that Tahina works with. Having people who can speak to the problems and who are basically on the bench ready to be called in when we need to address these problems is extremely important. That's really what the organizations that I work with focus on, having individuals who can help mentor, whether it be youth or active duty personnel, And I think that there's a lot to be said there. You know, we need to have folks that can speak to the issues that they experienced and can help people who are currently active duty, you know, navigate and deal with those issues. I'll finish, you know, my comments by saying that I do see a lot of progress being done. One of my biggest mentors in my career is now retired, but she had a very long 30-year career. Started off enlisted like myself. She ended up being an 06 captain in the Navy, and then went on to become a DISL, you know, as a civilian. And she's retired from both those careers, and she did it all being a gay woman, you know, during that era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And, you know, hearing her tell me stories about how she had to lie on her polygraphs, lie about her identity, lie about, you know, who she is as a person, very much inspired me. And I know has inspired countless people to make changes. And I'm happy that that doesn't exist anymore. I'm happy to see that there are more people, more minorities that are reaching those extremely, you know, those are the highest levels of leadership in the military, in business, in our society. You know, this idea of being a citizen, you know, of our country and reaching those highest levels is inspiring. And you know, I'll finish by saying that I have never and still do not have a mentor, active duty mentor, that looks like me, has my same cultural background, that can empathize with what I've gone through. I hope that I can be that mentor for somebody else. And I hope that, you know, in our audience, there's people who are inspired to become those mentors and really help one another out. And I have a lot of faith that, you know, in the near future, there's going to be more of those opportunities, more mentors to really help us grow from within, not just from without. So thank you very much for this opportunity today.
I don't know if I can top what Eduardo just said, but I did want to say something that both Eduardo and Peter spoke to. Peter mentioned how personal stories are really, it's what sets the difference, and how important it is to share your voice. And Eduardo, in his actions and all of the groups he's involved with, you know, he's taking personal responsibility. So yes, a lot of this is what can the government do for us through policy change, but equally as important is what can we as minority veterans do for ourselves, right? Let's not sit and wait for people to do the change for us. Let's work together like we're doing here to talk about these issues on what we can do to drive the change. And furthermore, I want to add that because this is it's excitedly a space that's opening up, a conversation that's becoming more and more frequent, because people are realizing the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's so much space for all of us that there's no need to fight within us, right? So there's space for all of us to work together to drive these changes internally with the help of policy, yes, but let's take initiative and responsibility and drive our own change.
Well, I could not have said it better, friends. Y'all are on fire this morning. It's early here on the West Coast, and I am hyped for my Saturday. So thank you for all of your comments and your feedback. I do want to highlight one additional place that folks can be engaging and providing support. One of our key partners here at Minority Veterans Affairs is the New Politics Leadership Academy, and we'll put that link in the chat for you. But for those of you that don't know, the New Politics Leadership Academy is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to recruiting and supporting servant leaders who serve through politics particularly. So would hate to not leave this with saying one of the other things that you can do beyond taking on that personal accountability, that personal responsibility, is stepping up to lead, to drive this public policy change that we've been talking about. And most importantly, and I love Tahina, you hit on this, that we're not just fighting for a change in the systems that we're operating in today, but we're fighting for a future that includes us all. I'm making sure, you know, Eduardo, as you're working to make sure that the veterans that are coming up behind us have opportunity, Tahina and Peter, making sure that the current system that we're in works better for everyone. really just want to acknowledge that you all are creating hope on the horizon for a future that includes all of us. So thank you for that. So next up, I want to share that we are pretty lucky. We get to see an amazing kind of exclusive video here from Illinois' congressional representative, Congresswoman Lauren Underwood. Representative Underwood has been an avid advocate for minority veterans, modeled through her work on legislation like the Protecting Moms Who Served Act, which is recently signed into law. She wasn't able to make it today for our live discussion, but I'll let y'all tune in to hear a bit more from her about her work.
Hi everybody, I'm Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, and I have the honor of representing Illinois' 14th Congressional District. I'd like to thank Lindsay Church and the leaders of Minority Veterans of America for the invitation to join this year's Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Summit, and for the ongoing work you do on behalf of our nation's minority veterans. I've been honored to work alongside you in our shared mission to advance equity, respect, and justice for all minority veterans. As a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, one of my top priorities has been healthcare for women veterans, who are the fastest growing group in the veteran population. And as a co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, I've been particularly focused on ensuring that veterans have access to the highest quality maternal health care and robust support during and after pregnancy. The United States is currently confronting a maternal health crisis. We have the highest pregnancy-related mortality rate of any high-income country, the only rate that's rising, and significant racial and ethnic disparities in outcomes. Black and Native Americans are 2 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white Americans, and Hispanic and AAPI people also experience disproportionately high rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. Some of the drivers of adverse maternal health outcomes can be even more prevalent in former service members. For example, 1 in 3 women veterans report that they experience military sexual trauma, which is linked with risk factors for pregnancy-related complications. With unacceptable maternal mortality rates for all U.S. mothers and unique risks for veterans, we must ensure that the VA is providing world-class care and support to moms who served. That's why I introduced the bipartisan and bicameral Protecting Moms Who Served Act, which invests in VA's maternity care coordination programs that ensure that pregnant veterans can access both clinical care and critical social services throughout the perinatal period. These programs include screenings and treatments for maternal mental health conditions, partnerships with groups that support new moms, and robust coordination between VA and community-based healthcare settings. The Protecting Moms Who Served Act would also invest in trainings for community maternity care providers so that nurses, midwives, and physicians caring for pregnant and postpartum veterans understand the unique needs of their veteran patients, particularly related to mental health and behavioral health conditions that might have been caused or exacerbated by military service or the transition back to civilian life. These trainings will ensure that veterans receive care that's responsive to the lingering physical and psychological impacts of their service. Finally, my bill would commission the first ever comprehensive study of maternal mortality, morbidity, and racial and ethnic disparities for veterans. By having a complete understanding of the extent to which our nation's maternal health crisis extends to our veteran population, we can develop solutions to improve outcomes, save veteran lives, and advance maternal health equity for pregnant veterans of color. I am honored to have the support of Minority Veterans of America on this bill, and I am excited about the progress we've made to advance the legislation. In May, the House passed the Protecting Moms Who Served Act with unanimous bipartisan support, and last month an amended version of the bill passed the Senate. Once we pass the updated text again in the House, the Protecting Moms Who Served Act will head to the President's desk to be signed into law. My bill will bring us one step closer to ending our nation's maternal health crisis and one step closer to ensuring that VA is providing all veterans with the high-quality, culturally appropriate health care they need and deserve. I look forward to continuing working with Minority Veterans of America to advance our many shared priorities. Thank you again for all the work you do, and thank you for the opportunity to join you at the Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Summit. I look forward to the day that we're all back together again in person, but until then, take good care of yourself.
Well, with that, friends, we unfortunately have no more time left in this panel, but I want to highlight for all of you that we have a full agenda today to make sure that you have the opportunity to continue to dialogue, connect with your peers, have conversations about the important work that you all are doing in community and that Minority Veterans of America can help support you in doing. I want to give a huge shout out to all of our panelists today who took time out of their very, very busy schedules to join us and share their insights and their expertise. Thank you to Tahina Montoya, to Peter Perkowski, and to Eduardo Vargas. You guys, your insights were amazing today and you are on fire. Thank you for the work that you are doing to advance and to fight for a future that includes us all. And for those of you joining us on, in the participants area, just remember that we have a full list of activities today. The summit is absolutely free to attend. We've got a job fair where you can be connecting with amazing employers. And so you don't want to miss it. Keep joining us and we'll see you again at the next event.